All right. Today, we're really excited to welcome our friend Luke here from Community Water Justice. Luke is a very active member of MYCJ, both in our core space as well as our general, kind of work. Luke's been with MYCJ for longer than I have, so for a while, and has been doing awesome activist work here in the state of Maine, and wearing a bunch of different hats, as he mentioned. So we're excited to have him here to talk about water and climate justice. And I will pass it over to Luke to maybe introduce himself a little bit further.
Thank you so much, Zach. It's an honor to be here with you all. Thank you for this space. My name is Luke Sekera-Flanders. As I mentioned earlier, I live in Freiburg, which is the unceded territory of the Pequawket people. I am going to share my screen real quick for my slideshow. All right. Here we go. All right. How's that look? Good? Brilliant. Yeah, so I'm a co-founder of Community Water Justice. We're a network of frontline communities across the state resisting water privatization and building toward a water secure future for all people. We are based in Maine, but we have partnerships with organizations across Turtle Island and even across the globe, as far away as rural agricultural communities in eastern France. Yeah. So I wanted to start with this phrase, which has been really has been impactful for me. It says water is our first medicine. This was a phrase that I became familiar with through learning about the Standing Rock Nation's resistance to the Dakota Access Pipeline out in Lakota Territory. But it made its way to Maine, and there was a lot of organizing and solidarity with Standing Rock, because in part there were parallel struggles happening here in Maine for tribal sovereignty and water rights. One of which was the drinking water crisis at the Passamaquoddy Reservation at Sabayik, which has been going on for 40 years and stems from the state's denial of the Passamaquoddy tribe's right to secure clean drinking water for its citizens. And second also was the state's effort to remove the Penobscot River from the jurisdiction and protection of the Penobscot Nation, which in all prior treaties had been ensured as a treaty agreement. It was never ceded by the tribe, but beginning in the I think mid-late 2000s, the state began pursuing an effort to remove the Penobscot River from being considered a part of the Penobscot Nation. And this ended up, this effort succeeded with the final decision in 2021, ruling that the state ultimately has jurisdiction over the river. Water is life. Water is at the basis of all living beings, and every activity, every product we have, we owe in large part thanks to water. I think in the range of all human achievements, it was a quote I read that was like, as proud as we may be of ourselves, every achievement we have ever made, we owe to 6 inches of topsoil and the fact that it rains. So, learning about the vitality of water is very humbling. And we have to understand that when we try to reduce water to a commodity or something that can be looked upon as merely a resource, for industrial purposes, and that we're missing a huge piece of the perspective, yeah, of indigenous peoples, and of an ecological worldview that understands that any mistreatment or any impact we have on water is going to negatively impact all living beings which rely on it. And this isn't, so I want to be clear that when I'm talking about water injustices, we're not talking about a new issue. We're talking about the latest iteration of a problem which has been present since first contact, since the beginning of colonialism and occupation. And I want to tie this into a crucial bit of local history. So, as I mentioned earlier, Freiburg is on the occupied territory of the Pequawket tribe. Maliaket was a member of the Pequawket tribe. She was a medicine woman who, after a series of genocidal expansionist wars waged by the English in the early 17th century, most of the Pequawket tribe was forced to flee north into present-day Canada, or east to find refuge with the other Wabanaki tribes. But Maliaket was among the few who remained, and she traveled sharing her knowledge of the land and its many medicines with settlers. She built a relationship with one particular settler, a man named Wentworth Ricker, who had come up from Boston, Massachusetts, and started he was an innkeeper in what would become the town of Poland, Maine. And one piece of this ancestral knowledge that she shared with him was of a particular spring, which was known to produce water that had medicinal qualities. It could cure chronic diarrhea and other stomach ailments. And she shared this presumably with as it was shared to her, with the understanding that it would be for the benefit of all who might come to rely on it, for use in a respectful and sustainable way. But Wentworth Ricker's son, decades after Maliaket's passing, looked at this story as mythology, which could be used as a marketing point. And he bought up the land surrounding this spring, closed it off to public access, and started Poland Spring bottled water, and selling this water as in a way similar to snake oil, as like this miracle product, and sort of incorporated this ancestral knowledge of the medicinal properties of the spring, and reduced it to just sort of a selling point. And so that's how we got Poland Spring. And so we have, the bottled water industry kind of predicated not just on the theft of indigenous land, but also the misappropriation of ancestral knowledge of the medicinal properties of these springs, which now no longer produce enough water to be bottled. So I got involved with well, let me backtrack a little bit, actually. So for a long time, bottled water was viewed as kind of just this upper middle class phenomenon. It wasn't widely consumed, because most people could rely on their groundwater sources. They relied on well water. But in the 1970s, with the development of PET plastics, which were the first plastic which could actually contain, it was the first easily mass producible. It was the first plastic that could be easily mass produced. It was very light and allowed them to cheaply ship vast quantities of water to for individual consumption. But there wasn't really a demand at the time. So how many of you have heard the phrase or heard that you need to drink 8 glasses of water a day to just to be healthy? You can, but you probably shouldn't drink that much water. And that's, that point emerged directly. It came out of the bottled water industry's marketing campaign to get people to consume more bottled water. And also, that went hand in hand with a campaign to basically foment distrust in tap water. They sold their water on the assurance that their water was cleaner than what was coming out of people's taps. Now, this is true in many cases where, especially in poorer communities with failing water infrastructure or places that were in industrial centers where groundwater was polluted. So there is some nuance there. But generally, this luxury product was being sold to people as a necessity, and which was predicated on a lie. And so I got involved in 2012 when Poland Spring entered a 45-year contract, technically a 25-year contract with 4 5-year extensions, 5-year automatic extensions, but effectively a 45-year contract with our town's private water supplier. They were able to do this without the town people's consent. And the Public Utilities Commission held a public meeting only after receiving so much flack from the community. And in that hearing, scores of local residents testified against the length of the contract, and only perhaps one person from the community testified in favor of the contract. And, that was an individual who stood to financially benefit from this business contract. So that just gives you an idea of the strong feelings of the community against this contract. But we ended up, a group of residents ended up suing the Public Utilities Commission for approving this contract without, against the will of the community, and on the basis of environmental impacts. And this ended up becoming a 3.5-year-long legal battle. And this ranged from 2012 to 2016. So especially towards the end, this was when things were really happening at Standing Rock, and water rights and water protection was really coming to the forefront for a lot of people. But the state of Maine ultimately ruled on the side of the Public Utilities Commission, saying that it wasn't within the PUC's purview to consider environmental impacts when considering contracts for bulk water extraction. And it's also worth noting that when the Public Utilities Commission approved this contract, every single commissioner had a personal, a conflict of interest, had in some way or another financial ties to Nestle, which was at the time Poland Spring's parent company. And so even though we lost, we had begun the process of building relationships with other frontline communities that were facing similar issues, like in Hollis, Maine, or Kingfield, where Poland Spring is also extracting large quantities of water. We also built relationships with indigenous water protectors, and that was about the time that we got involved in that that the Penobscot River case. And so this is all happening in the global context of the climate crisis. We know that climate change is causing more and more longer and more severe droughts in regions of the world that have historically experienced an abundance of clean water. In Maine, it also looks like longer periods of drought, but also much higher and more rapid quantities of rainfall. So we have like flash floods followed by long periods of drought. So while overall we may be receiving more rainwater, that doesn't translate to stability or water security. In fact, floods pose a huge risk to water infrastructure and can lead to a really highly elevated risk of groundwater contamination. And so as global water insecurity is rising, I think by 2030, more than half of the world's population will not have steady access to clean drinking water. So that means more people are going to be relying on imported water. And so while some with a practical sense of this as a humanitarian crisis, others look at this as a business opportunity. So of course, more focus is coming from investment groups and multinational corporations on areas that have an abundance of clean drinking water, and Maine is one of those places. And we're pretty far behind on this. These corporations, they have their long-term strategy locked in. They understand the trajectory we're on, and they understand that as time goes on, the value of water is only going to become more clear. And that if they can secure privileged access to groundwater sources now, they have firmly secured their place as their privileged position in the global economy for years to come. But we're not at that point in Maine. There is still a lot of assumptions remain about water in Maine. A lot of folks will say, you can't hardly dig a hole without reaching water, or we were in the state house this last legislative session, and one legislator got up and said that Maine running out of water is like Saudi Arabia running out of oil. It ain't gonna happen. So, those kinds of assumptions and that short-sighted view kind of permeates the legislator and our regulatory institutions right now. There isn't a sense of how climate change is impacting not just Maine, but the world around us. And so we already have multinational corporations shifting their focus on our water sources. The question is, are we going to rise to the occasion and place the same level of or greater effort and attention to our water sources with the intention of protecting them for the benefit of future generations and for all who may come to need them? We, in Maine, we have as sort of the basis of groundwater law, or the laws that are affecting groundwater use, is a rule called absolute dominion. This is a law that emerged during the 1800s and is largely obsolete. I think Maine is one of between 3 and 5 states in the entire country that still adhere to this principle. But in it, basically, a landowner can use as much groundwater as they possibly as they can, because if you own the land, you own the rights to the water beneath it. And so you're not accountable for, with however much you extract, you're not accountable to whatever impacts that may have on your neighbors. This was really rectified in a 1999 lawsuit called Maddox v. Giles, where a gravel pit operator dewatered the gravel pit, and that resulted in the neighbor's well going completely dry. And that went up all the way to the state Supreme Court, where they ruled that because the legislature had not updated Maine's laws about groundwater protections, the court was going to rule on the side of the gravel pit operator, but again, only because the state of Maine hadn't updated their water laws in so long. And it was that same, starting from 1999 on, that Poland Spring really began ramping up their operations, which it had just recently at the time been purchased by Nestle. So, and in the years since then, any effort in the legislature to update Maine's groundwater extraction laws have been fiercely opposed by Poland Spring, because when you're not accountable to any impact that your extraction might have on your neighbors, that looks good for a bulk water extractor. If you're trying to meet this rising global demand, it means you can get away with it. This is a multinational corporation that is trying to cut costs wherever possible and maximize profits. So, of course, when and in this case, that's coming at the expense of the local community. And in 2021, Poland Spring and all of Nestle's North American water assets were sold to a pair of private equity firms operating under the title Blue Triton Brands. And private equity firms, their whole function is to buy assets, cut costs, make them as profitable as possible, and then sell them to another company. So arguably, Blue Triton is at least as bad as Nestle, because Nestle, they still had their bad reputation from their many horrible deeds across the globe following them. This private equity firm doesn't have the same reputation, and they don't have to tend to this reputation, so they're solely focused on cutting costs and setting the company up for whoever the next buyer is going to be. That doesn't change the fact, though, that Poland Spring has been extremely effective in their greenwashing and public relations campaigns, as well as making exercising undue influence in the state legislature and with regulatory agencies. So when I mentioned earlier that legislature making his smart comment about Maine being comparable to Saudi Arabia, that was in the context of this bill, LD 1111, which was an effort to place a 10-year limit on bulk water extraction contracts. This was a sensible measure, because 45 years is a ridiculously long time to lock a community into an agreement to extract what's essentially an unregulated amount of water from the community, without consideration for the lasting effects of climate change, population growth, and other considerations. So a 10-year limit was really the least radical, the least it was a simple proposal that didn't take any of the other necessary steps that would involve like power structure reform. and decision-making reform. So it was really a low-hanging fruit. But the amount of opposition that we received was incredible. On the day that we went to the State House for the floor vote of the House, we counted over a dozen lobbyists representing Poland Spring and other private interests opposing this bill. Whereas it was just two citizen not even lobbyists, I mean, just two people who went up to engage with lawmakers on this bill. So the amount of influence in that regard alone is incredible. Also take into account the fact that until recently, there were paid Poland Spring employees sitting on the Board of Environmental Protection and the Maine Drinking Water Program, which are both regulatory agencies that had a direct say over, over laws and the regulation of bulk water extraction. And so this is a graphic that came from our friends up in Ontario, where they were facing a similar situation, where they can get away with saying that their extraction is within government guidelines because they have such a firm hand on these regulatory agencies and on the legislative process, which regulates their activities. So it's really a fox watching the hen house sort of deal. In Freiburg and in all the communities they extract from, they self-report. There isn't a single agency tracking how much water they're extracting. And as far as accountability mechanisms for if they do end up taking too much water, there is nothing really. In Freiburg, we had a period of drought where multiple wells went dry. And we also saw that, at night, there were as many as 7 Poland Spring tankers lined up at the well here in town, lined up to take water out of town. But the burden of proof for demonstrating that Poland Springs extraction had any impact on any of these wells rested with the landowner. So if anybody wanted to come forward saying that, hey, Poland Spring needs to slow down or stop their extraction, they would have needed first to come forth with a study, and none of these landowners could afford to conduct their to conduct their own independent studies. So really, it was just there was a very high barrier to even getting the state to act in that way. But we also have to remember that, like, again, this is a local issue within a global context. And as frustrating as it has been working on this issue and seeing the many barriers to progress, we've also seen that water rights and water protection is a vital issue, and it is a unifying one. There are many, as we've seen, whether it's, opposition to water privatization in Kenya, or the Cochabamba water war of 2003, where in Bolivia, indigenous peasants rose up against against the government and against the IMF and the World Bank, to basically reverse the privatization of the city's water system. It's a catalyst for action, and for many people it helps when people's access and the security of their right to such a fundamental life way as water is threatened. It helps them to see larger systemic issues at play. And in many ways, the impact of our work as organizers around water rights and water justice are intangible, because it's been largely about a culture shift to just get people to think about the future of water access and the future of the resources that they rely on.